On a stage she has stood on countless times before, everything looks familiar at first glance. The lights are the same warm hue, the band knows exactly when to pause, when to swell. The audience rises on instinct, as if muscle memory alone can summon the past. And then Yvonne Chaka Chaka steps forward. The voice is still there, recognizable within seconds. A voice that once carried across borders, radios, generations. But this time, it arrives a little slower. Not weaker, just measured. As if each note has been carefully negotiated before being released into the air. There is a brief pause before the first line, longer than usual, long enough for someone in the front row to lean forward without realizing it. No one says anything, not yet. At 60, she smiles the way seasoned performers do, softly, economically, without excess. Yet behind that smile, something has shifted. Her shoulders lift slightly with each breath. The rhythm between phrases stretches, almost imperceptibly, but enough for those who have followed her for decades to feel it in their bones. This is not the urgency of youth anymore. This is something else. In interviews, the change began quietly. Answers that used to flow effortlessly now arrive after thoughtful silences. Not awkward, not confused, just slower. Journalists notice they are speaking more than usual, filling the gaps she once dominated with stories and laughter. She listens carefully, nods, then responds with precision, as if conserving something precious. Her calendar tells a similar story. Tours announced with confidence are later trimmed down. Appearances that once stacked back-to-back now come with generous spaces in between. A city here, a pause. Another city weeks later. When asked about it, the explanations are polite, vague, almost rehearsed. Rest, balance, listening to my body. Words that sound harmless until they begin to repeat themselves. There are also the absences. A charity event she never misses goes on without her. A festival poster quietly removes her name. Fans exchange glances online, careful not to sound alarmist, but unable to ignore the pattern. Is she okay? Someone asks. Another replies, with reassurance that feels more like hope than certainty. What is striking is not what she says, but what she avoids. There is no dramatic announcement, no medical language, no attempt to frame herself as fragile. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of focus, fewer commitments, shorter conversations, a growing preference for reflective answers over celebratory ones. When she speaks about the future, her words are chosen with unusual care, as though she is aware that promises carry more weight than they used to. Those close to her notice it first. Long rehearsals replaced by shorter, more intense sessions. Chairs placed just off stage. Water always within reach. None of this is hidden, yet none of it is explained either. It sits there, in plain sight, daring people to draw their own conclusions. And then, finally, she acknowledges it. Not with drama, but with honesty that lands heavier precisely because it is understated. She does not name an illness. She does not describe symptoms. She simply admits that her strength is no longer something she can take for granted. That some days require more effort than others. That her body now asks questions it never asked before. For a moment, the room goes still. Because this is the admission everyone has been circling around without daring to touch. Not the collapse of a legend, but the quiet recalibration of one. A woman who spent decades giving energy outward, now learning how to ration it. A performer who once outran fatigue, now walking alongside it, acknowledging its presence without letting it define her. She speaks calmly, almost matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. Yet the shock does not come from the words themselves. It comes from the realization that time, which always seemed to bend around her, has finally begun to assert itself. Not cruelly, just firmly. There is no plea for sympathy, no invitation to mourn, only a sense that something fundamental has shifted, and that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The stage remains. The voice remains. But the silence between them has grown more meaningful than ever, carrying questions no one is quite ready to ask out loud. There was a time when Yvonne Chaka Chaka seemed almost immune to fatigue. In photographs from those years, she is always standing straight, shoulders open, chin lifted. Not in a posed way, but in the manner of someone who genuinely does not need to conserve energy. Her smile was wide, unguarded. The kind of smile that suggested motion, airports, late nights, early mornings, and another stage waiting just beyond the horizon. She was everywhere. One continent blurred into the next. Europe this week, Africa the next, then across the ocean again without complaint. Interviews stacked tightly between rehearsals. Sound checks followed by meetings, meetings followed by flights. When others spoke about burnout, she spoke about purpose. When schedules looked impossible on paper, she treated them as invitations rather than warnings. Back then, rest was something other people needed. There was a sense, quiet but persistent, that she ran on a different internal clock. While younger artists disappeared for months citing exhaustion, she kept moving. While peers scaled back, she expanded. Not recklessly, not dramatically, just steadily, as if motion itself was the source of her strength. Those who worked with her remember the pace more than anything else. Not rushed, relentless. She arrived early, left late, asked questions when others were already packing up. Even after performances that left crews drained, she lingered, still engaged, still alert. Fatigue was something she acknowledged in others, rarely in herself. That image settled into public memory. The woman who did not stop. Which is why the contrast feels so sharp now. Not because she has vanished, not because she has fallen, but because the rhythm has changed. The same woman who once crossed time zones without blinking now speaks openly about limits, without drama, without bitterness, simply as facts. The language of endless availability has quietly been replaced by the language of choice. There is restraint where there was once overflow. It shows in small decisions. Saying no where she once said yes without hesitation. Ending conversations a few minutes earlier. Choosing fewer appearances rather than chasing visibility. None of this is framed as loss. Yet the difference is impossible to miss if you remember how she once moved through the world. She does not romanticize the past. There is no nostalgic monologue about being stronger then. She simply acknowledges that the version of herself who could go on forever belonged to a different chapter, one defined by momentum rather than maintenance. The striking thing is how little she explains. She does not catalog achievements. She does not defend the pace she once kept. She lets the contrast speak for itself. The audience is left to place the images side by side, the tireless traveler of memory, and the woman now choosing when to step back. There is dignity in that restraint, because this is not a story about collapse. It is about adjustment, about a person who once measured life by how much she could carry, now learning to measure it by what she must protect. The shift is subtle, but irreversible. And perhaps the most unsettling part is realizing how rare it is to witness such a transition without spectacle. She was once an emblem of unbroken motion. Now she stands as something more complex, a figure who understands that stopping is not surrender, but a skill learned late, and often at great cost. The past version of her still exists, in recordings, in memories, in the way crowds react the moment her voice is recognized. But the present version carries a different weight, not lesser, just heavier with awareness. And somewhere between those two images, a quiet reckoning continues, unfolding without commentary, inviting the reader to notice what has changed, and what will never be the same again. For a long time, the questions existed only as a feeling. Nothing was said outright. No headlines screamed concern. No official statements asked for understanding. Instead, there was a subtle shift in tone, one that attentive audiences tend to notice before anyone else does. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but settles quietly into the background. Fans began to sense it first, not in panic, not in alarm, but in curiosity edged with unease. Comments under videos grew more cautious. Praise was still there, unwavering, but threaded through with gentle check-ins that hadn't been necessary before. She seems different lately. Is it just me? Or does she sound tired? The questions were phrased softly, almost apologetically, as if no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what everyone else might also be seeing. The press followed suit carefully. Interviews continued, but their shape changed. Conversations that once roamed freely now circled certain areas without ever landing. Journalists asked about legacy, about reflection, about slowing down, safe topics, respectable topics. Health, when it hovered nearby, was treated like a door left deliberately closed. No one pushed it open. Not out of ignorance, but out of restraint. When a question came close, it was quickly redirected. A smile, a broader answer, a pivot to music, to impact, to gratitude, and everyone accepted it. Or pretended to. What stood out was not avoidance itself, public figures do that all the time, but how consistent it became. The same careful choreography repeated across platforms, across countries. As if there were an unspoken agreement between interviewer and subject. We will not go there. And yet, the silence stretched. Weeks passed. Then, months. The absence of clarity began to speak louder than any rumor ever could. People weren't reacting to speculation. They were reacting to the vacuum left behind by unanswered curiosity. It wasn't fear that grew, it was attentiveness. A heightened awareness of every pause, every cancellation, every softened response. The longer nothing was said, the heavier the quiet became. Public silence has a way of changing meaning over time. At first, it feels polite, then private. Eventually, it starts to feel intentional, not deceptive, just guarded. And once that shift occurs, even the smallest details gain weight. A missed appearance is no longer just a scheduling conflict. A shortened answer, no longer just a matter of mood. Fans didn't demand explanations. They watched. They waited. They remembered how openly she once moved through the world, and how measured everything now seemed. The contrast invited interpretation without ever offering confirmation. In media circles, the caution deepened. Editors trimmed questions before they were asked. Producers adjusted angles, durations, expectations. No one wanted to cross a line that hadn't officially been drawn, but everyone sensed it was there. A boundary invisible, but firmly respected. And so the conversation stalled in a strange, suspended state. Too much awareness to ignore. Too little information to confront. This prolonged quiet did something unexpected. It united uncertainty. People from different places, different generations, found themselves sharing the same low-voiced concern. Not gossip, not drama, just the shared discomfort of noticing change without being allowed to name it. Because when explanations are absent for too long, imagination fills the space. Not wildly, but carefully. And that careful imagining, repeated over time, becomes its own form of worry. The silence endured. Not dramatic, not explosive, just steady, unbroken. And in that stillness, the public learned that sometimes it is not what is said that unsettles people most, but what remains deliberately, persistently unspoken. The moment, when it finally came, did not arrive with ceremony. No special setting, no prepared audience, no carefully staged lighting to frame a confession. It happened almost in passing. Yvonne Chaka Chaka was answering a question that wasn't really about health at all. It was about work, about pace, about how she chooses her projects now. The kind of question she had answered many times before, with grace and polish. This time, though, there was a pause that lingered just a little longer. Not hesitation, consideration. She inhaled, slowly, as if checking in with her body before continuing. And then she said it, not dramatically, not defensively, almost quietly, that she feels tired in ways she didn't used to, that rest is no longer optional, that some mornings her body decides the tempo, not her will. There were no tears. Her voice did not crack. Her expression did not collapse. If anything, she looked relieved. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Because they weren't framed as loss. They were framed as reality. The kind of reality that accumulates gradually, year after year, until one day it can no longer be explained away by a busy week or a long flight. She spoke of fatigue the way one speaks of weather patterns, something observed, acknowledged, adapted to. Not an enemy, not a failure, just a condition that now exists. There was a sense that this admission had been rehearsed privately many times before being spoken aloud. Not in front of mirrors or advisors, but internally. A conversation between mind and body that had been ongoing for years, finally reaching a point of agreement. What she described was not sudden weakness. It was accumulation. Miles traveled, nights shortened, expectations carried without complaint. All of it settling quietly into muscle and bone. She did not blame age. She did not blame work. She simply stated that the body eventually stops responding to command the way it once did. That intention alone is no longer enough. That discipline, while still present, now needs cooperation. The room did not react immediately. No gasps, no murmurs, just a shared stillness, as if everyone needed a moment to recalibrate what they were hearing. Because this wasn't the narrative people are used to. There was no collapse to mourn, no heroic struggle to applaud. Only acceptance, calm, measured, unmistakably real. She did not ask for understanding. She assumed it. And perhaps that was the most powerful part. The absence of apology. The refusal to dramatize what so many experience but rarely articulate. She spoke as someone who had stopped fighting the truth of her own limits, and in doing so, removed their sting. Her posture remained steady, her tone unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. The admission was not about stepping away from life, but about stepping into a different way of inhabiting it. Later, people would replay that moment, searching for hidden signals. They would analyze phrasing, tone, timing. But there was nothing hidden there. No coded message. Just a woman naming her reality without embellishment. And in that simplicity, something profound happened. The fear people had been carrying, quietly, privately, lost its shape. It didn't disappear, but it softened. Because what she offered was not tragedy, but clarity. Not an ending, but an adjustment. She stood there, fully present, fully herself, not diminished, just honest. And in the long silence that followed her words, it became clear that this was not a moment of defeat, but of recognition. A recognition that strength does not always mean pushing forward. Sometimes it means knowing when to slow down and being unafraid to say so out loud. 60 does not arrive like a door slamming shut. It doesn't announce itself with pain sharp enough to demand attention. It comes quietly, almost politely. Through small negotiations the body begins to insist on. A slower morning, a longer recovery after things that once required no recovery at all. A sudden awareness that energy, once endless, now has edges. For Yvonne Chaka Chaka, age did not feel like a number. It felt like friction, not resistance, exactly. More like the realization that effort no longer guarantees the same return. That pushing harder does not always mean going farther. And that the body, after decades of cooperation, has begun to speak in a language that cannot be ignored. There is nothing dramatic about it. No single moment where everything changed. Just a sequence of limits so small, they were easy to dismiss at first. One event declined because the travel felt heavier than usual. One rehearsal shortened because the voice needed quiet. One commitment reconsidered, then another. Each decision reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. This is how age arrives for those who have lived intensely. Not as collapse, but as accumulation. She does not describe herself as tired of life. Far from it. What she acknowledges is a new relationship with capacity. The understanding that every yes now carries a cost that must be paid somewhere else. Sleep, silence, stillness. Things she once borrowed from without consequence. Now they demand repayment. Work is no longer about proving endurance. It is about selection, about asking which projects deserve her energy and which simply demand it. The distinction matters more than ever. Not because the spotlight has lost its appeal, but because health has gained urgency. There is a quiet courage in learning to say no after a lifetime of saying yes. No to travel that disrupts recovery. No to schedules designed for younger bodies. No to the expectation that presence must be constant to be meaningful. These refusals are not rejections of her past. They are acknowledgments of it, of how far she has gone, of how much has already been given. She speaks of listening to her body now, not as a slogan, but as a practice learned late. The body no longer whispers. It pauses her mid-sentence. It slows her stride. It insists, gently but firmly, that attention be paid. And she listens, not with frustration, not with self-pity, but with the recognition that ignoring these signals would be a form of disrespect. To herself, to the life she has built, to the future she still intends to inhabit. There is something deeply human in this shift. The transition from conquering to conserving, from expansion to intention. It does not diminish her story. It deepens it. She has traveled too far to pretend otherwise. The woman she is now carries memory in her muscles, history in her breath. Every performance, every journey, every demand left a trace. At 60, those traces begin to speak back. Not accusingly, just honestly. And so the priorities adjust. Health moves closer to the center. Not as fear, but as wisdom. Glory becomes optional. Well-being becomes essential. The applause still matters, but not enough to override the body's request for care. This is not resignation, it is refinement. A woman who has lived at full speed learning the art of restraint. Not because she must disappear, but because she intends to remain. Present, grounded, alive to what still matters. Age, in this sense, is not an ending. It is a narrowing of focus, a clearing of noise, a reminder that the body, after carrying so much for so long, deserves to be heard when it finally asks to be. After the admission, nothing exploded. There was no rush of commentary flooding the airwaves, no dramatic reframing of her story, no sudden urgency to explain or interpret what had already been said with such restraint. The reaction instead settled into something quieter. People absorbed it. Fans did not respond with panic. They did not rush to console her as if she had announced an ending. What surfaced most visibly was a pause, an instinctive step back, a collective lowering of volume. Messages were shorter, words chosen more carefully. Admiration remained, but it shifted tone, shedding excitement for something steadier. Respect. The media followed the same rhythm. Coverage did not spike. Interviews were not dissected for sensational fragments. If anything, the questions softened. Journalists stopped circling the topic entirely, as if acknowledging that the truth had been offered once and did not need to be extracted again. There was no hunger for more details. Silence returned, but this time it felt different. Not evasive, not heavy. Simply complete. In that stillness, Yvonne Chaka Chaka receded from the public eye in the most ordinary way imaginable. Not through disappearance, but through presence elsewhere. Away from microphones, away from stages, away from the careful posture of being watched. Morning finds her in quiet. No schedule waiting to be outrun. No flight to catch. No sound check echoing in the distance, just light filtering in slowly, the kind that takes its time reaching the room. She moves without urgency, listening to the cadence of her own steps. The day does not demand performance. It allows space. There is something grounding about these hours. The absence of applause sharpens other sounds. The kettle heating, the faint rustle of fabric, the distant rhythm of life continuing at its own pace. This is a world she has always known, but rarely stayed in long enough to notice. Here, she is not a symbol. She is simply a woman moving through her morning, attentive to how her body feels before asking anything of it. There is no need to conserve energy for an audience, no reason to summon strength on command. What exists is enough. Those around her seem to understand this shift intuitively. Conversations are lighter. Expectations recalibrated. No one asks what comes next. No one presses for reassurance. The admission has already done its work. What remains is acceptance, not as an announcement but as atmosphere. She does not frame her days as recovery or retreat. They are just days, lived at a pace that finally aligns with how she feels. Some are active, others quieter. None are measured against who she used to be. The world, remarkably, allows it. Perhaps because her story has earned this kind of listening. Or perhaps because people recognize something of themselves in the way she has chosen honesty over endurance. Either way, the absence of noise becomes its own gesture of care. No tributes are demanded, no farewell narratives written. Just room, and in that room, she exists without explanation. Not defined by strength or fatigue, but by presence. The stage will still be there when she chooses it. The light will return when it is needed. For now, the quiet holds, not as retreat, not as loss, but as a space where nothing has to be proven, and nothing has to be said. Late afternoon light stretches across the room, slow and unhurried, the kind that turns ordinary walls into something almost cinematic. Yvonne Chaka Chaka stands near the window, not framed for an audience, not centered for a camera. Just there. At 60, looking back does not feel like nostalgia. It feels like inventory. The years do not line up neatly. They overlap. Cities bleed into one another. Applause echoes without a clear source. She remembers movement more than moments, the constant forward pull, the sense that stopping was never part of the plan. Strength once meant continuity. Momentum. Staying visible. Now, the silence offers a different kind of clarity. Her reflection in the glass does not ask questions. It doesn't demand answers either. It simply exists, carrying traces of everything that came before. The woman staring back has lived many versions of herself, some louder, some relentless, some defined by how much she could give without pause. None of them feel false, but none of them can be returned to intact. There is no urge to summarize what it all meant, no attempt to shape the past into a lesson. She lets the memories arrive without commentary, the first stages, the crowds that felt endless, the belief, once unspoken, later unquestioned, that the body would always comply. It did, until it didn't. Fame, in this quiet, feels oddly distant. Not irrelevant, just less urgent. It sits somewhere behind her now, like scenery passed on a long drive. Still impressive, still real, but no longer demanding attention at every turn. What presses closer is the body itself, the weight of it, the honesty of it, the way it now insists on being acknowledged not as a tool, but as a companion with limits of its own. Not fragile, just finite. She does not resent this realization. There is a softness in finally understanding that strength was never meant to be permanent. That endurance, however celebrated, is not a state one can inhabit forever. The mistake was not believing in it, but believing it could last unchanged. Outside, the day continues without her participation. No cues to follow, no expectations to meet. The world does not pause or rush. It simply moves. She watches it for a moment longer, hands relaxed at her sides, breath steady. Nothing about this scene announces an ending. Nothing promises a return. It is just a woman, at the edge of a long view, allowing herself to stand still without explanation. And somewhere in that stillness, a thought lingers, unfinished, unresolved, about what it means to be known, about what the body eventually asks for in return, and about the quiet truth that no matter how luminous a life becomes, no one is meant to be strong forever.